Good afternoon and a very, very warm welcome to this special DIW Lecture 100 by Professor Claudia Goldin. We're very, very happy to welcome you, Claudia. This is a great honor for us. We labeled this Lecture 100, DIW 100, because this is our 100th birthday or anniversary as an institute this year. And we were founded in 1925 with the task of doing evidence-based, data-based research. Ever since, that's exactly what we have been trying to do. We couldn't think of a better lecture commemorating our 100th anniversary than having you, Claudia, here, because you have been a role model for us as economists for doing exactly that, data-based, evidence-based research on topics that are highly relevant for society and have helped uncover many blind spots that we have in our profession. We as an institute have always worked evidence-based for the last 100 years. We actually now have one of the biggest and longest running data surveys, household surveys in the world with the GSEP, the German Socioeconomic Panel, which has been running since 1984, covering about 30,000 individuals, almost 15,000 households every year. And as I said, this is a very, very rich source for doing excellent research, not just in economics, but in all of the social sciences. And our objective is not just supporting research, but providing that data, but doing interdisciplinary research ourselves. What is important to us is independence. We are funded through a public science grant, through the Leibniz Foundation ever since. So we do independent research. And our task, what distinguishes us from a university, is that we have the transfer component very central in our task book. So our job is to inform the public debates, to accompany them in a critical way, to uncover blind spots in the debate. And we have been doing this in many different fields, in environmental economics, on inequality, and also on gender. I'm very proud to say that we as an institute, we were one of the first, at least in Europe. We are lagging behind compared to the US in many ways, but at least in Europe, one of the first to have established a gender economics research group, which I'm very proud of, and which 10, 15 years ago was still smiled at, was not always taken as serious as it should have been. And that has changed thanks to the work also the people in the group have been doing. I see Elke Holst here, who was the initial founder of the group. I see Katharina Wrohlich, who is the current head of the group. So for that reason, it couldn't be a better fit than having Claudia Goldin as a keynote speaker here today. Now, as a formal introduction, Claudia is the Henry Lee Professor of Economics at Harvard University and also holds the Lee and Espeleta Professorship of Arts and Sciences at Harvard. She was the director of the NBR's development of the American Economy Program from 1989 to 2017 and is currently still one of the co-directors of the NBR's Gender and the Economy Group. She was awarded the 2023 Nobel Prize in Economics for having advanced our understanding of women's labor market outcomes. So it's a great pleasure to have you, Claudia. Before handing over to you for the keynote, I also want to very warmly welcome Bernd Fitzenberger and thank you for being one of the panelists discussing with Claudia and with Katharina. Bernd is someone who has been in Berlin for a while, has been very close to the Institute for a long time. He's currently the director of the IAB in Nuremberg. He also is professor in Nuremberg-Erlangen of quantitative labor economics. And I also want to thank Katharina Wrohlich, who's our head of the Gender Economics Group, who has put together this event with many of the colleagues here at the Institute and is organizing also the exchange afterwards. Katharina is professor of public finance, gender and family economics at Potsdam University and has been at the Institute for a long time and is currently the head of the group. Just briefly to the further plan. Claudia will give, Professor Goldin will give the keynote lecture now. This will be followed by a discussion with Bernd Witzenberger and Katharina Wohlich, and then we will have at the end time for discussion, for questions from the floor. I know this is a small room. We only could accompany a few people here in the room, but we have more than 200 people online, so also a very welcome to you. But without much further ado, thank you very, very much again, Claudia, for giving us the honor, and we look forward to your lecture. Thank you very much, Claudia.
Okay, very, very good. Okay, greetings to everyone here and those online. So my talk today is going to present 3 facts, and it's going to pose 2 questions, which I hope I will answer. And the first fact is that fertility has declined everywhere in the world. And the second fact is that for many rich nations, the fertility decline simply isn't new. And the third fact is that fertility levels in many countries have been below replacement, and that's given generally by the number 2.1, but that depends upon mortality. So for many rich countries, it'll be 2.1. So for many of these countries, they've been below replacement for a very long time. And I'm going to end with what can be done to change some of that. So now we have our bird over here. So the 3 facts are fertility decline is everywhere today, levels in most countries are below replacement, and the decline in fertility in many parts of the world simply isn't new. So let me clarify and substantiate what I've just said about these 3 main global fertility facts. Okay, first of all, the total fertility histories of 4 countries are given here, including the 2 most populous in the world, China and India, and the largest in the global south, Nigeria, plus Mexico, and the entire world, okay? And this will demonstrate some of my points. The horizontal dashed black line is the approximate replacement rate for countries with reasonably low mortality rates. And note that total fertility in China plummeted years before the one-child policy. Many of you may know that that was preceded by something called later, longer, fewer, and that had a very, very large effect, although we always think about the one-child policy as being the be-all and end-all in China's fertility. Also note that India's total fertility rate is currently below replacement, so that's the 2nd largest country in the world and may even become the largest soon. And also that Nigeria's total fertility rate, while high, has also decreased. So I'm an economic historian, so starting with 1950 or 1970 is much too early. So I'd like to start the discussion with a longer run history of birth rates here from 1850 for 8 nations. And so by the time my story is going to start in the mid-20th century, fertility levels had already greatly declined across Europe and the United States. In the late 19th century, the average woman would have had 4 to 5 live births. Okay, every woman in the audience is going, oh my God. Okay. I said live births. They didn't all survive, and then you can also say, oh my God. Okay. But that figure declined to around 2 in most places by the 1970s. Now, we can see this more clearly if I took out some of those countries and just have a few, the US in blue, Sweden in green, and Germany, a complicated line in orange. Okay, part of the earlier decrease was because infant and child death rates plummeted in much of the industrialized world in the early part of the 20th century, and families learned that they didn't have to produce as many children to have a few survive. But the continued decrease was truly non-Malthusian. It occurred with vastly increased incomes. So as I noted, not only has there been decline, but the levels in most nations are less than at replacement. And more than half of the 193 members of the United Nations have a total fertility rate currently less than replacement. They contain 2/3 of the world's population. Among the 38 member nations of the OECD, only one had a total fertility rate in 2023 that was above replacement. You can all figure out which one it was, okay? And 23 of those 38 had a rate that was less than 1.5, or that was in 2023. Furthermore, 25 of these OECD nations, that's 66% of them, have been below replacement since 1980, okay? In most of the richer nations, the decrease to levels below replacement, therefore, occurred decades ago. So given the first two facts, we should step back and say, there should be a common cause. It can't be that each of these countries is completely different. They're going to be different in some manner, but there has to be something that is common. And given fact 3, we also have to step back and ask, why has discussion swirled around these topics now? Those are the two questions that I'm going to answer. The unifying or common factor that I'm going to emphasize is the increased agency of women, and a related factor that I'm going to term the mismatch. Although the reason for greater self-determination of women will differ from place to place, the ability of women to control their fertility with almost complete certainty will be a unifying factor. Fertility control across many nations didn't just alter the timing and the number of births. It altered a lot more. It altered the age of first marriage. It altered the timing of births. It altered education of women, particularly higher education of women. It altered their desire for long-lasting jobs, something that we would call careers. Okay. There is no shortage of models and empirical studies of the birth rate, but none has confronted the fact that when women are given expanded educational and career opportunities, they will be enabled to have children only if they're also given more certainty about their and their children's futures. Why invest in one's career and education if one can't reap any returns from it after having something else that you wanted, which would be a child? Why have a child if it means giving up the future income and security that you thought you would have? The care of children cannot be fully outsourced. If it could, why have the children? If women must provide virtually all of the care, or a very large fraction of it, for their children, they will not be able to realize the returns from their education. So to understand this better, I want to consider a very simple, the simplest model you can think of. It's a 2-period model. In period 1, some group of women, a subgroup in the society, let's say that's pi of the full group, some subgroup, can invest in a college education. Not all can, some can. Now, alternatively, women can work in a non-college job for some wage, let's call it W. So in period 1, you can invest in college, or you can work at a job for a wage, let's call it W. In period 2, all women can have a child, any woman can have a child, and all can work. They can work in a college job, if they went to college, for cap W, or they could work at a non-college job for lowercase w, which is less than cap W. That's the return to education. If they have a child, the father of the child must share the care of the child, or the woman will not be able to take the college job and earn the college wage. She goes to college, she has a child, she discovers that she has the full care, she won't be able to have the career that she thought she was going to have. The question then, in solving this simple model, is whether women will invest in education, and if so, given that they invest in education, whether they will have children. Now, there's another side to this, okay? Because gender is not one-sided. And for us to study gender, we have to study both. And in fact, we've done too much studying only one, okay? Men, in my model, can be of two types. And very simply, I will call one of them dads. Those are the high type, the ones when there's a kid, they take care of the kid. They're the ones who put in the time with their child, or they can not be dads, they are duds. And those are the ones who don't put in the time, okay? Now, let little p be in the population, be the population probability that a random man is going to be a dad. Let's say that 50% of the population of men will put in the time. Maybe it's 35%, maybe it's 99%, probably not, okay? And assume that the aggregate P is actually public knowledge. Everybody knows what it is. However, it is never observed for a particular man until after the fact. What's the fact? The baby. Therefore, the choice facing a woman who is college ready in that pie group in time period 1 is, should I go to college or should I not go to college? And in period 2, her choice is, should I have a child or should I not have a child? In the extreme case where P is equal to 0, and we can call that the Duds rule case, women will invest in education if the returns are sufficiently high, but no college woman will ever have a child. But if P equal 1, take the extreme cases, that's the Dad's rule case, all women for whom higher education is profitable, all of those in pi, will invest in college, and all educated and non-educated women will have children. That will be the highest fertility rate. The world, of course, is somewhere in between. At some level of P, that's, remember, the probability that a random man would be a dad. At some level of P, women will go to college, but never risk having the children. For higher levels of P, college women will have children, but some will discover that they can't have the careers. The higher is the college wage premium given P, the more women will go to college. The smaller is P, the lower will be the birth rate. And so this is just a very simple model that's in the paper. A potential mismatch exists between what women require to incentivize them to have children and what men can credibly commit to. The mismatch is the main reason why the birth rate has plummeted across a wide range of countries since the 1970s, especially those in which women have gained agency in terms of fertility control, education, and employment. There are two ways to increase the birth rate in this model. Remember, I didn't say in the real world, I said the model. One way is a regressive way, and it would shut down female agency, perhaps by restricting female education or limiting birth control options. We don't like that. The progressive method, on the other hand, would increase the fraction of high-type men. It would increase P. Another would be to increase the information about the husband's type prior to the child's birth. Another would be to give guarantees to mothers, but as I noted, childcare cannot be fully outsourced. So now what I'm going to do is give two examples of the unifying factor, one from history and one more from a shorter run history with regard to, so one having to do with the US, one having to do with the world. The first with regard to the US case, and the next concerning the role of the macroeconomy in the fertility decline. I'll end by answering that other question, which is why are we discussing fertility now when all of this has been going on for so long? So I'll begin with the case of the US. So the figure here contains about 1.25 centuries of data on both the total fertility rate and the birth rate, which is also known as the general fertility rate. That's just the number of births divided by the current group of women between 15 and 44. Total fertility is more of a cross-section version of a cohort number. So around the year 1957, the demographic tide of the baby boom, you can see this incredible baby boom in the US. The demographic tide of the baby boom began to turn, and birth rates in the US began to fall. Notice how much lower they were before the baby boom. And interestingly, that was also, 1957 was also the year that the pill was first approved by the FDA in the US for medical use. 3 years later, in 1960, it was approved for contraceptive use. I am not saying that this decline was due solely to the pill. Even though the pill was available, its use by even married women was circumscribed by state laws. In the US, we call them Comstock laws. The original one was a federal one in the 1870s that was championed by someone named Anthony Comstock, who was the head of the YMCA. But that soon changed for married women, but it took almost a decade or more to change for young and unmarried women. And I'll make that clear. The removal of legal constraints allows empirical identification of the impact of the pill on the age of first marriage. So reducing these constraints on unmarried women gives us the ability to understand the impact of the pill on the age at first marriage. As shown here, it was 23, so that's this line over here. It was 23 for college graduate women for some time. After all, many women graduate from college at about 22. Marrying, to have a median age of 23 means that half of the group married before 23, which from my undergraduates makes them very nervous. But to think about it, it means, and these are college graduates, so it means that you've shored up that guy before you graduated, okay? And there were names for these things. It was called Ring Before Spring, okay? Okay. But what you can see is that this age suddenly began to increase around 1972. Suddenly, almost out of nowhere, it goes zoom. And we can identify that as being when many of the state Comstock laws had been changed by the courts or by state legislatures. The pill enabled these young women to put off getting married. The added years before marriage gave college women enough time to do something, to get an MBA, to get a law degree, to begin medical school, and I always say, and to begin a PhD program, and everyone says, oh, because those are ridiculously long, much too long. So it gave them autonomy. But without credible commitment from the child's father, they needed to solidify their careers before they had children. They delayed having children. In consequence, the fraction who never had a child greatly rose. And as seen here, the fraction of college graduate women with no lifetime births, that's this group up here, with no lifetime births, peaked with the cohort born around 1955. That was a long time ago. That's the birth cohort. That's the women's birth. And it peaked at around 28%. That's an incredibly high number. The birth rate for that cohort, if you compute it as I have done, was less than the equivalent of today's total fertility rate in the US of 1.62. Subsequent cohorts of college women had higher birth rates. You can see that this is going down. That's the fraction with 0. But those have also been fairly low. Similar changes occurred for the non-college graduate group, but a little bit later. A greater fraction of all eventually had no children, and a growing fraction who eventually had children would never marry. In sum, about the U.S. case, and this is a small part of what I gave you before, this is from 1950 to the present. In sum, the U.S. birth rate plummeted, you can see, a half-century ago. It occurred as the value of women's time in the labor market increased relative to the value of her time at home. It also occurred as women had greater ability to marry later, a lot later, years and years later, and get more education and obtain more job experience before they got married. Because women had more autonomy, they had more options. The opportunity cost of children to highly educated women and to even not so highly educated women rose. Women needed greater assurances that the care of their children would be shared with the father, and that wasn't always forthcoming. My second example here extends the insights of this model that I just presented to a large group of currently developed nations that have had divergent fertility paths, but also very different macroeconomic histories. This figure here has total fertility rate data for 3 countries, Italy, Korea, and Spain, countries that had relatively high fertility in 1970 and fertility that later dropped to be among what demographers call lowest low. That's below, they defined it as below 1.3. The levels drop below those of another group of countries. Here I picked 3, US, France, and the UK, that had moderate fertility rates in 1970. The question here, as you can see with the blue lines and the orange lines, is why these two groups of countries essentially traded places. Why did the latecomers to economic growth, and I will soon add Greece, Portugal, and Japan to the list, experience a larger fertility decline than countries whose growth was more constant? Countries like Korea, Spain, and Italy that grew rapidly and in which women were suddenly given greater agency have a generation of men who gained more from maintaining older traditions and a generation of women who gained more from casting them aside. Mismatch increased and fertility plummeted. Economic advances in Italy, Korea, and Spain were so rapid that there was little time for generations to fully adjust to an altered structure of household and market production. Thus, the rate of growth of the macroeconomy can have profound effects on microeconomic decisions. To investigate these notions, I chose 6 countries that had economies that grew somewhat continuously over time, over a long period, we'll see. And here are Denmark, France, Germany, Sweden, the UK, and the US, and I call them Group 1 countries. Their fertility rates since 1950 are given here, and you can see the post-World War II baby booms in all of them. The US had a real baby boom. The others I call a baby boomlet because they were much littler in all of them. And then in all, a decrease from these booms or boomlets, so that by the 1970s, remember, all had moderate to low total fertility rates. I also picked 6 nations that had more stagnant economies for a long time and then had very rapid growth and convergence to the frontiers in terms of technology. Those are Greece, Italy, Japan, Korea, Portugal, and Spain, and I call them Group 2. Their total fertility rates began exceptionally high. They then declined, but then they actually collapsed to being, as I said, lowest low levels. I just mentioned differences in the macroeconomic history of these 2 groups of nations, and so let's look at that. That for Group 1 shown here, and the vertical axis here is log of GDP per capita and purchasing power parity, which means that the slope here is the rate of change of increase in GDP per capita in real terms. And as you can see, for Group 1, there's a fairly steady increase in per capita economic growth, despite obvious substantial volatility in periods in the 1940s in particular, and for some in the 1930s. But contrast that to Group 2 nations that had economic stagnation, real stagnation here until the 1950s and 60s, and then incredibly rapid catch-up. Korea, of course, is the most extreme case until the 1990s. Not only did these countries have rapid growth after 1950 or 1960, but many also had substantial migration from rural regions. Once again, Korea is the best example, where so many Korean families moved from rural Korea into Seoul, which was sort of the great absorbing state in Korea. So many had substantial migration from rural to urban areas. The 2 groups of countries here, in terms of their macroeconomic histories, are given side by side. the rapid growth for Group 2 nations produced conflict between men and women. Generations of parents and grandparents who had spent their lives in rural areas and had very low levels of education, low levels of income, had children who would live in cities, be far more educated. Rapid economic change often challenges beliefs, and beliefs change far more slowly than do economies and technologies. Traditional people are often thrust into modernity with little time for traditions and social norms and mores to adjust. In periods of rapid development, men gain more from partly remaining in a past. Women gain far, far more from taking full advantage of a present, especially when they can advance their education and alter where they have been working, essentially their employment. The swift economic change may lead to both generational and gender conflicts and rapid reductions in the birth rate. Men are not inherently more traditional than are women. In fact, one might think the reverse to be the case, but rather they actually benefit more from traditions that they grew up with. We can call that patriarchal traditions. Women, however, experience greater gains from more equal gender roles. These conflicts can be best comprehended from some pretty simple data on women's excess burdens at home. So on the horizontal axis here is the difference in the household and care hours per day done by the average woman minus the hours done by the average man. On the vertical axis is the total fertility rate. Fertility is higher when men and women share more when this number is small, and fertility is lower when men and women share somewhat less. Okay. And as you can see, the two sets of 6 nations clearly group by these relationships. And I can put in lots and lots of other countries, and they would fill in this gap in through here. So it's not as if there are, other countries are over here or over here. They're actually all over the place over here. Okay. So all Group 2 countries had less sharing and lower total fertility than Group 1 countries. Therefore, countries that had sudden and rapid growth or those with an excess number of unpaid hours worked by women relative to men, they also had lower birth rates. Okay. So in sum here, I've documented the 3 fertility facts, and I've answered only one of the 2 questions that I began with. I answered whether the decline of fertility across vastly different nations suggests a common factor, and the answer is it does. The declines have closely followed the greater ability of women to marry whom they want and when they want, to be able to invest in their education and in their futures, and to have reproductive freedom. I've emphasized the possibility that frictions and mismatches in society and in individual relationships have each contributed to birth rates that are lower than optimal. But if fathers and husbands can credibly commit to providing time and resources, the mismatch would somehow disappear. But commitment is difficult to ensure. Perhaps one method is to live in a country or a state in which there's social opprobrium that obliges men to provide the finances and time and mental resources to the family. I love the notion of social opprobrium. Another way is to live in a nation or society, a state, a community that funds childcare just as it does public education. Okay, so what I'll conclude with is to address the second question, which is, why has concern over the birth rate been voiced recently in many countries, despite the much longer history of fertility decline? Many nations, authoritarian or not, are trying to increase the birth rate. Orban's Hungary gives a tax exemption to any woman with 4 or more children. I think she deserves more than a tax exemption. South Korea offers hefty housing incentives to families that are low income and have newborns. And recall the Dobbs decision in the US in 2022 that overturned Roe v. Wade. And during the 2024 US presidential campaign, J.D. Vance, now the vice president of the US, asked, and I quote, whether a childless cat lady, and of course he referred to Kamala Harris, could run the country. But of course, here's the most famous childless cat lady. Maybe she should run the country. And also recall that during this same presidential campaign, Trump, who is now our president, said, "I want a baby boom." And then he added a famous line that no one quite understands what he meant. He said, "You men are so lucky." So I can think of 3 reasons for current concern. The first is that decreased immigration has been a stated policy of many countries, particularly the current U.S. administration, and of course many in Europe. And internal population growth is, of course, viewed as a long-run substitute, certainly not a short-run substitute, for decreased immigration. Second, the family has always been a vital foundation of social stability and is being called on now to play a role as a replacement for economic supports once provided by the federal government. The family is also the bedrock of social conservatism. And finally, third reason, there is a sense expressed by some governmental and private sector leaders, as well as in many surveys, that various firm and governmental policies have moved too far in the direction of gender egalitarianism. But reversing progressive change could increase the degree of mismatch and lower the birth rate further. So, in conclusion, the downside of fertility is that greater female autonomy, in the absence of sufficient change to guarantee child care, has lowered birth rates. And so I thank you very much. Notice that this is a very optimistic stork here. It came back up again across the entire world. So I thank you very much and look forward to your comments.
So thank you so much, Claudia, for this great and inspiring talk. Can you maybe just take a seat here in the middle? And also, Bernd, take a seat. Thank you so much, Claudia, for this talk. Thank you, Bernd, for also joining us in this panel discussion. Thanks for your interest. As you rightly said, Claudia, in your talk, the development of fertility rates is a very important political topic, not only in the US, as you've shown, but worldwide. And we are discussing this in Germany, actually, intensively. Every country in Europe is topic about this topic right now. And then also when talking in particular with researchers or policymakers from South Korea or Japan, they're all deeply worried about fertility trends, and they are trying to do something about it. So my first question, Claudia, to you is, what kind of policy implications can be drawn from your analysis?
Right.
In particular for those countries with low fertility rates that try to increase them?
I think I answered that.
Yeah, just
it's okay, I'm joking. I think we have to realize that there are two sides of the word gender, and that we have been paying too much attention to one side, and that we should pay a lot of attention to the other side and think very hard about that. And think very hard about how to make certain that men, given that we do not want to have a regressive solution. The regressive solution, remember, is simply saying, okay, women, you know, you were on a roll for a while, but forget about it. You know, you have a PhD, you work very hard at it. That's very good. You learned a lot. Now, you know, go back to the kitchen. That's not going to happen. Okay, so this is, you know, Pandora's box. It's been open, it's out. You know, now we're going to have to do something. And what we have to do is make certain that we create more dads and fewer duds. But there are two problems with that we're not realizing, and they concern the labor market itself. Okay, so we keep on thinking that we have a problem. It's called, you know, baby production, and it only concerns baby production, and it only concerns childcare and things like that. Fine, but that isn't the case, because this is a market system in which everything is interrelated. So therefore, number one, we have the problem in many countries that many of the jobs, that many of the brawn jobs that men think are the ones that they should take, those are no longer there. And so these are a discouraged group of individuals who retreat. And when they retreat, they're not just retreating from the labor market, they're retreating from home and family life, okay? And this is why in many countries, particularly the US, the less educated women have babies, but they don't have husbands, okay? They don't have... Every baby has a father, but that father is not sort of around. So the first thing is doing something about that group is extremely important. And part of that is making certain that there are a ton of great jobs in the healthcare and the tech sector that are not brawn jobs, they're brain jobs, and they're caring jobs. And so we have to find ways of uplifting that group. I think that that's an extremely important part of it. The other part, on the other side of the income distribution, is that the jobs that the college and plus educated group take are extremely greedy jobs. And so then the family sits down and it says, okay, you know, I married you, we got married because you're a real dad sort of person. And he says, yeah, I really love taking care of kids. Now we can see how much income we're giving up because we're doing it jointly. So I think that we can worry about what's going on in the household, but we really have to pay attention to both the issues concerning men, particularly at the lower end of the education distribution, and the labor market, particularly at the upper end of the income distribution.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So when we talk about Germany for a second, so I think, I mean, you laid out at the end of your talk quite nicely a couple of hypotheses why, in particular in the US, but also in other countries, this issue of low fertility is discussed right now in the political debate. I think Germany is a bit different. So I remember that already in the early 2000s, Germany was discussing its family policy quite controversially because it realized that things were not going well. So Germany was spending actually a lot of money on family policy per capita, mostly due to high lump sum child benefits and tax allowances for children and married spouses. But it was actually doing rather poorly on a couple of indicators, such as maternal employment, which was low, educational outcomes, that was the time of the first PISA shock in Germany, and also the fertility rate, which was really very low at the time. And then as a reaction to this, actually two major family policy reforms were launched. So the first one was the expansion in public childcare, not universal, but the expansion in public or publicly subsidized childcare. And the second thing was the introduction of the parental leave benefit, the Elterngeld in 2007. Basically, that pays parents an income replacement for 14 months, and 2 months are earmarked to each parent individually. So, Bernd, in your research, you have actually looked at this reform and you have analyzed its effect on employment and fertility. So what effects did you find? And also in the sense of Claudia's model, do you think maybe this parental leave helped as a contracting device in terms of bringing in the fathers via this earmarked parental leave? Or was it more about the state stepping in for fathers? So can you share us maybe some of your results with us?
Yeah, thank you, Katharina. And let me start by congratulating DIW, which was started for the 100th birthday, which was started at the Institute for Business Cycle Research. And I think we were talking about social conservatism, populism, and the relation to the topic we are talking about. What I'm struck with history is also how DIW, how the Institute for Business Cycle Research went through the Nazi time. This booklet really nicely shows that. And the Nazis declared the end to the business cycle. They renamed, and business cycle research was not a topic to be done anymore. Very interesting parallel to some of the discussions we see today. The Nazi times also are a reason. When I was a young researcher, pro-natalist policies were something one must not talk about in Germany because the Nazis did that. We've gone beyond that, exactly as you said, Katharina. And our research, joint research with Armin Seidlitz, a former PhD student here in Berlin, showed, following on work by Anna Raute, that the intention of the reform was fulfilled in the sense of balance work and pay. That was work and life, work and care and that is typically, as Claudia said, discussed as a female issue. Chancellor Schröder called this still a female Gedöns for the Germans among us, and make women have a career and have babies. That was the idea of the discussion then. And better educated, higher earning women showed a slight increase in fertility. So I think in response to the Elterngeld. And that's why I'm also skeptical about current discussions by some of our colleagues who want to stop Elterngeld or reduce it for high-income women, because I think this will have negative fertility effects based on our evidence. I'm not talking about the really high income. There, this probably doesn't matter, but sort of in the middle of or upper half of the income distribution, this plays a lot of role. But it's still within the German context. Part-time work is the dominant form. The other parts of maybe increasing agency, getting a better return to your education, that did not work. We did not see a strong increase due to the Elterngeld reform in full-time work among mothers. And the take-up of fathers, that's exactly along Claudia's line, the take-up of fathers of the father months is much lower. Yeah. It's changing now, but it was very low in the beginning.
And by the way, same or very similar findings have been shown for the childcare policy expansion. So there again, positive effects of fertility have been shown by various authors. And then also, that's research that we've done here, but also others have done it. We also see that increased mothers' labor force participation, but in part-time. So full-time did not react to the same amount. Yes, exactly. So let's stay in Germany for the moment. And we have prepared this slide on the German fertility trend. Can you maybe put the slide on the screen so that we are all on the same page and know what we're talking about exactly? So I'm sorry that this is not in English, but basically what you see here is the total fertility rate in both parts of Germany, East and West Germany, from 1945 to 2023. And what we clearly see is the baby boom or boomlet, because we don't have the US on the scale, so it looks quite big without the other. So we see the baby boom after the Second World War in both parts of the country, or in both countries, East and West Germany. And after the baby boom, West Germany sticked at very low fertility rates, well below 1.5, while in East Germany, in the GDR, there was the second small boom. You already talked about this in the 1970s, and it had consistently higher fertility rates until the end of the 1980s. And this has been attributed to pro-natalist policies like housing opportunities for families, but of course also to universal free childcare.
But note, it's still below 2.
Yes, yeah. It's still below 2. It just looks really high because it's contrasted with West Germany. Yeah, so that's why. And of course, we also need, of course, to keep in mind that in this communist system, of course, wage trajectories would also follow a very different logic than in market economies like the US or West Germany. So after reunification, we've seen a very strong decline in fertility in East Germany, which has then recovered again. And then very recently, since 2021, in Germany, but also in many other countries of the world, we see a very strong decline again in fertility rates. So here's my question to both of you. So what can explain this very last decrease in the fertility rates that is now here shown for Germany, but that we see worldwide?
Yeah, I think that it's pretty clear that we had a pandemic in 2020, and that's one possibility. As an economic historian, I never like to say anything unless I have at least 10 years of data.
Okay, so we'll ask you again in 7 years.
And we can prove how wrong we would be in many, many cases.
Yes.
But we can't really, so there are two things. One is that what you didn't say, but maybe was implicit, was that in the US in 2007, in much of Europe in 2010, there was decline due to the Great Recession. And the big question, because we really do have hindsight on that, is why there wasn't recovery from that, okay? That was like a one-time drop, both in the US and in many, many countries in Europe in 2010, okay? I mean, how can we think that that the pandemic wouldn't have some effect? I think that what was surprising in the U.S. was that it didn't have a bigger effect in the first year. That the idea was that it was going to be very difficult for couples to even think about going into a hospital. And remember that there were many women who gave birth without the birth father present because of the pandemic. The birth rate didn't decrease anywhere near as much as we thought, but it decreased somewhat. Some of the change in the U.S. since, and this is in the paper somewhere, since some of the decrease since 2007 is due to sort of three factors. Two of them are sort of okay, and one of them is a problem. One of the factors is that the Hispanic population in the U.S. has, quote, Americanized and had fewer births. The other one is that there's a continued decline in teen pregnancy. Okay, but the third one is really what I'm talking about, which is that the more and more American women are going to college. More and more women across the world, and we can talk about that, are going to college. And that group has really decreased its birth rate, right? So I think it's sort of taking this and sort of pulling it apart a little bit more, okay? But also remembering that the pandemic surely had effects in 2001, 2002, and remember that babies still take 9 months to produce. And in fact, as many of you probably saying, 9 months, I tried, 14 months, 18 months, okay.
And you want to add on this?
Yes, of course, this delay consumption is important when looking at time series data. I will not wait 10 years. I at least conjecture one important fact which I take from the GDR experience, but also from post-World War I or World War II data. In times of crisis, of uncertainty, of transformation, planning becomes uncertain. Also, the macroeconomic effect, which you have talked about, also, Claudia. We did not see a Great Recession effect, but we didn't have a Great Recession. So that doesn't disprove what you said. Germany went surprisingly well through the Great Recession and also through COVID. So the decline in birth rates after COVID, but this is really very icy territory, 1-2 years. In the beginning of COVID, at least, you see here in West Germany, birth rates even went up. But then we also have a strong change in the composition of the population with the refugee, with the assimilation of what you called Americanization. We also see that if you looked at the non-German citizenship part of the population, you would see even much stronger increases and decreases. I've looked it up in preparing today. So it's very dangerous to overinterpret such time series data for a short number of years, but still the decline is quite strong over the last 3 years when COVID was over. And I personally think, given the discussions we have in Germany, that the hypothesis that the increasing uncertainty, we have mental health issues rising, coping with life has become more difficult in the crisis, economic recession we are in, not crisis.
I also remind everyone that total fertility rate is a cross-section version of a cohort. It's actually a backward-looking measure. And so this is why I always prefer cohort measures, but you're not going to get cohort measures until much later.
Okay, thanks a lot. I would also like to open the floor to questions from the audience. So please don't be shy and raise your hand. I think we have we have microphones. So if you want to ask questions.
Thank you very much also from my side for this inspiring talk and inspiring discussion. I wonder one thing what we also in this total fertility discussion also discuss and which was not addressed so far is the so-called fertility gap, which is the difference between the ideal number of children which are perceived by women and men and the actual number of children. And I think in the whole policy debate, this is another very important issue because it makes a difference if the fertility gap also went down for policymakers, which means that the people don't even want more children, or if the fertility gap actually increases because the difference between the number of children people wish to have and their actual children is increasing. So I wonder how do you take care of this kind of gap between wishes and realization, which I think is very important also for policymakers.
So all the data that I've seen, it's very, very difficult for any individual who is answering a question to say that what they have is not what they want. So in fact, realizations, I mean, there's almost no one who has children who says, I made a mistake, okay? So so the data that I've looked at, and so this is from, let's say, the National Longitudinal Survey, and I was looking at data that came from someone's study. So looking at the NLS 79, 16 times asks individuals how many children they would like to have. They ask men, they ask women, okay? And the number always hovers around what's considered to be the norm at that time. And then and it turns out that at the end of the day, the difference between men and women in their desired number of children versus how many they have is very, very tiny. So we're actually not getting a very good read on individuals not having what they really want to have. What they have is what they want. What they wanted when they were younger is not necessarily what they have. So it's an extremely good point, and it's sort of very, very hard to get at, to take someone and say, what did you really want? Because every individual is making all these trade-offs in their life. Where they are today is where they chose to be. So it's just very, very hard to talk about a fertility gap. And certainly doing this, then I thought, well, I would find something bigger for women than for men or vice versa. And there's really very little difference.
But maybe, Katharina, one question for you, because Claudia, you don't know, Katharina is the head of the institute that provides us with these nice data. Since you mentioned it, is it true that this last decline in that fertility rate that we saw on this chart we don't see that if we ask people for their fertility wishes? Is that true, or
did I? We don't see that. The fertility gap is actually increasing because the wishes are constant and the rates go down. Therefore, I mean, there is a whole literature of this fertility
but the question
gaps.
is ex post. If you ask a 45-year-old woman who has
of
one
course,
child,
we don't have exposed measures for the current cohort of women who could get it. But what we know from the past, I think the fertility gap is something, and we find huge differences. And we do this research among various countries with the Gender and Generation Survey. There is one colleague with me here who does that. And we find actually fairly high differences, and also the differences change over time.
Can you tell me what you mean differences in what?
In the wishes and the realization.
The wishes,
the fertility.
when the person is what age?
Different ages, different.
And so, that exact person, their realization.
Yes.
Yeah, but that doesn't say that, I could say I really want to eat a very big meal. And then at the end of the day, I decide, well, I really didn't want to eat the big meal. Okay. So I'm not certain that you're correct that there's a difference between what they said when they were younger and what they did when they were older, but that doesn't necessarily mean that there's a gap.
No, but we also do it for the same age cohorts. And I mean, there is this literature on these fertility gaps, and you can control by age and all these kind of things. And yes, and I think it's important to have these subjective measures, because my point is that if family values decrease, and if people, it could be one reason that we say, okay, the fertility goes down because the people just don't value family anymore as they did 20 years ago. And therefore, I think this kind of measures are important for this subjective evaluation.
I think it's relative. It's always that you make trade-offs. You may value, I may value family the same, but there's something else that appears that I can have that I value more.
This is definitely true, that it's always a measure, a matter of that.
I think one way, in the logic of your model, Claudia, if you were to extend your model to higher order fertility, I mean, you would learn after the first child whether the father is a dad or a dad. I didn't know the English word, but and that may affect. And when you got married or you decided to have a child with the dad, you may have had a misperception and then adjust.
And this is why it's very interesting in the German case to look at the fraction who have no children and the fraction who have children.
Exactly.
Yeah. And that fraction who have no children has really increased by quite a lot.
And I think my personal, but that's just a hunch, maybe in response to Katharina's point, is that if you're raised if you're a young woman in Germany in the 2010s, 2020s, where all these policies were implemented, Katharina talked about, you have the perception this is going to work. And then after the first child, you may learn, it still may be a bit more difficult, especially with the dad.
So there's one other question.
Thanks from me as well for the very inspiring discussion so far. My question is, Professor Goldin, you compared a lot of different countries. I'm here. Very different countries with like very different gender models as well, and family policies like Sweden, Finland. And I always wonder, I mean, Sweden, Finland, Norway, they were always like beacons for us, like when it comes to family policies, parental leave for dads, much more engaged dads. And why is there also the fertility rate going down? Do you have an explanation for that? Because that also raises the question, what kind of policies can we actually do if you want to change male models?
So I think your question is, why did fertility rates change even in Sweden? Right.
That's right.
So that's the model, right?
Sorry?
Well, the model is a model of female autonomy. So the model is that women say, this is the life I want. The life I want can accommodate this many children, even given the care of the father and the subsidization of the state.
Even if the dad is not a dad, but a dad, it's not.
Right.
It's not enough.
Yeah,
okay.
It may not be.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay. Another question here.
And anyhow, you know, even if we got up to 2, there's still some who are going to have none for one reason or another, and so it'll be below 2. And then you might say, well, why isn't it higher? Okay.
And also, to be fair, I mean, these countries that you just mentioned, they had higher fertility rates for quite a long time.
Yeah.
Only
but I think
very recently.
Her question is why are they have fallen somewhat, right?
But they were well above West Germany. but only now. So in the post-COVID, I mean, the pandemic, of course, hit them as well, and other crises that we have to deal with right now, they are affected by them as well. So that might be a case where we still see that. Okay, there was another question.
So thanks a lot for explaining your model here. I think I completely understood it. But my question is, so we are always looking at the woman in this discussion, or mostly looking at the woman. According to your model, so the male factor is very important. So the political conclusion could be to work with the men, to educate the men to become better dads. And is there research how to do it? Have you there any clues in your model?
No. I don't solve those problems. I just point out what the problem is.
Okay, yeah.
Okay, we also have to realize, I hate to say this, but I'm also a student of the natural world, okay? And I'm a bird watcher, okay? And it's only in the northern hemisphere that any male bird spends any time at the nest. It's an interesting phenomenon. Just throw that out.
What about the penguins in the Antarctic? I thought they were super dads. Like they were, warming their eggs. No, isn't that true?
Yeah, that's any place it's cold.
I see.
Any
cold.
place it's cold.
So it's about the temperature.
Any place it's warm. Okay, think about the following. You're sitting in the nest. Clara's in the nest. And she has her little young in the nest. And it's really, really warm. She could get off her nest, go get her banana, and come back to the nest. But if it's cold, if she gets off the nest, her babies will die. And so then, by natural selection, the daddy gets the banana and brings it back. In fact, he's sitting on the nest. She gets the banana and brings it back. It's a very interesting phenomenon that we have to think hard about. So you asked me, how would I solve it? I can't solve it because it's all over the natural world. We have to think of something else.
Yeah, so I got the microphone over here. Thank you so much. This was very nice. I just wanted to point out some insights on the point that was just raised. I think we recently see some studies on interventions with boys in classrooms about masculinity norms. I think those are quite interesting and promising, where we see that gender attitudes do change after some of these interventions, making boys aware of what masculinity norms are, how they may be harmful, whatever that means. And so I was also wondering, when you were talking, whether you raised this earlier, whether it's really about, educating people differently very early, or what can be done for those who, at this point, they are the types they are, and what can institutions do versus what needs to be done earlier, but that takes time, right?
So I think the real issue is that the family is the building block of all society. The notion of having one man, one woman, a yin and a yang, all of that is the essence of every religion, okay? So now we're saying we're going to sort of re-educate our world in a completely different way than we have educated it since the beginning of time. And perhaps that is what modernity is all about, okay? But we have to realize that social conservatism is essentially this notion that stability is the family. The family is one man, one woman. This is why gay life, transgender people has been put such fear in the social conservative movement, okay? And so I think it's extremely important for us to realize that this isn't take the policy magic wand and go like this. We're talking about every religion, every belief system there is, okay? and we have to figure out a way of finding a way to have more equity.
Hello, thank you for your presentation. I have a bit more of a normative question that kind of goes beyond your presentation, but I thought that there was this very strong normative assumption that it is the goal that fertility goes up again, right? And I think in modern discourse, there's not only a rise in talks about we have to increase fertility, but also a rise of an anti-natalist movement, kind of with strong arguments against rising fertility rates. And I was just wondering, because obviously you're not a philosopher, but you're an empirical economist, but how do you justify this very strong assumption that was in your lecture?
There was not an assumption at all.
I mean, not when you were describing.
No.
But in the end, when talking about
as not saying that we should increase. The word "should" never appears in my work. Okay. I am definitely not a normative economist.
Yeah, I know. I mean, that's why I thought it goes beyond. But I was just wondering.
But it's a very, very good question.
I was wondering what your thoughts on this topic are. Maybe then.
So we can now discuss: should we care about having fertility rates below replacement? Okay, that's a separate question. Okay, and that is not a question that I have addressed yet in this talk. But I have addressed it elsewhere, and I have said, I don't care. Okay.
Okay, that's also an answer. Thank you.
You want to say something?
But I have said something else, which is a very positive statement, and I said it here. I said that I am against impediments, okay? And if there are impediments that we can figure out how to get around, then we should get around them. Okay.
Ben?
I mean, as a sort of a positive economist, not posing norms, I would say that declining fertility, demographic change, aging of society poses a number of questions and problems. And if the speed of the decline in the population increases, these problems increase. I mean, financing social security will not be possible in Germany anymore. If the decline, I think it's possible with somewhere in between 1 and 2, but if we go down to levels like Korea or Japan, the tensions will be so high, and there is a political reaction. I mean, there I'm with Claudia. We see Claudia Goldin's. We may have very different policies in the end in response. So at least I think it's a concern for policymakers, where like the pay-as-you-go pension system works smoothly with a growing population. Adenauer said in '57 when it was introduced, or when it was the dynamic pension was introduced, people will always have children. He was wrong.
People will always be children.
No, enough, he meant.
No, I
mean, Social Security.
I think that what's interesting is that it was not that long ago that a famous book was written called The Population Bomb. Okay, and in The Population Bomb, there's a famous sentence that says, in the 1970s and the 1980s, hundreds of millions of people will die from hunger. Okay. And so there was not that long ago. It's fascinating how we sat in this room in 1975, we'd be talking about the Ehrlich's book, The Population Bomb, and we would be looking at each other and saying, how can we slow the population increase, okay, in many parts of the world? And we're sitting here 50 years later worrying about the opposite.
Yeah, exactly.
And I would say, in response to the question about normative positive, that I would much rather worry about this than worry about that. And most importantly, do not think that there is any number that is an optimal number. There is no brilliant mind out there who's going to tell you what the optimal population rate of increase should be right now. Because that person, to say that, would have to say that the population number today is optimal, okay? And I don't think they can say that.
Okay, I think we have time for one last question. Yes.
Thank you very much also from my side. I think much of the public discussion on having children, how we can increase that, is always centered around policies that favor the dual earner model, right? And what happens then is that women can have children and a career. And the term that then came out of this discussion was the double burden that arises from it. I hardly hear about the double joy that women can have. So,
I have talked about that. I often say not burden, joy. Okay.
The question is whether it can be a double joy, and whether we pay enough attention to increasing the utility that individuals or parents draw from having children, instead of experiencing this overburdening. And with your suggestion to increase fathers' involvement, it could go in the same fallacy direction that having both parents with a child makes everything better, or at least for the women. Maybe it's going in exactly the other direction, because then nobody is drawing any utility of the child anymore. That's just a hypothesis, and I wonder whether we pay enough policy attention on how individuals can draw more utility from having children and, exploit more joy from it.
Well, what do you think the answer is?
I mean, you partly mentioned your observations from the birds and so on. So in all parts of the economy, we figured out that specializing and trading increases our overall welfare. But for families, we take the different perspective, right? We think that everyone in the family taking the lead in all sorts of domestic and market work would be the way to go. But from the standard economic theories, we would say that is probably not the welfare increasing way to go. So I'm not saying that we should regress and then again specialize on women doing domestic work, but maybe we need to figure out or allow also social norms to accept the one earner model in the family, irrespective of who is doing the job with the children. It could be the man or it could be the woman.
Right.
Maybe we should
that's
randomize
exactly
that.
Right. No, in fact, in my book, Career and Family, there are various solutions. And so you can have gender equality, but not couple equity. That's right. And so you're absolutely right that you can have one person have the burden and one person have the joy, one person have the joy and one person have the burden. But I think that we probably put a certain amount of weight when we have these couples form in households that they share. They're not doing things equally, but they're doing things equitably, okay? And also we're doing things so that we ensure each other. And I think the problem that giving women autonomy has had is they finally have said, I require insurance in my lifetime. And I think the problem is that we don't have a way of having credible commitments so that we could all enjoy the children. Yeah.
So as one of my colleagues said, in the end, it's a moral hazard problem, right?
It is a moral
hazard.
Yeah, it's a contract problem.
Yeah, it's a contract problem. So how can we fix the contracts from the side of the woman to to have a guarantee that whatever has been promised before will then be also lived. Okay, thank you so much, Claudia, for the
And I'm sorry
lecture.
that we haven't solved all the problems.
But we invite you all for
are.
coffee and cake, and maybe we can chat a little bit more about possible solutions. So you're all invited to come to the lounge to enjoy some coffee and cake with us. Thank you so much, Claudia.
Sure.
Thank you, Bernd, for joining. Thanks for the audience for all your questions.